Some say we should be careful what we dream, because dreams have the power to save us or hurt us, depending on where they originate and how far we dare to pursue them. But for Sarah Collins, dreams weren't dangerous. They were all she had left, a way to survive when the world seemed too cold, too harsh, and too unfair. And it was in a simple notebook with a worn cover that she found the only refuge capable of transforming tears into hope, pain into words, and loneliness into poetry. That's precisely why you, who are watching this story, need to subscribe to this channel now. Because here you'll always find narratives that touch the soul deeply, that make you reflect and believe in love again, even when all seems lost. Stories like the one you're about to discover now. A story that could be yours or any of ours, because we all carry a notebook of dreams hidden somewhere within our hearts. At night, when the city glowed with its artificial lights, Sarah walked the wet streets carrying a worn bag, and inside it the small notebook she never left behind. She worked cleaning luxurious offices, the kind that reflected power in every mirrored window, but where her presence was limited to the silence of the early morning, when there were no executives or secretaries, only cold desks and switched-off computers. In each break, between scrubbing a floor and gathering forgotten papers, she opened the notebook and wrote another page, recording dreams that seemed impossible, like seeing the sea, having a real family, or seeing little Erin, the girl she had welcomed as her daughter, grow up safely without feeling the pain of poverty. For her, those pages were the only proof that there was still life within her, even if everything around her screamed otherwise. The grandest building where she worked was named after a man she had never seen in person, but whom everyone spoke of with respect and fear. Richard Bennett, a millionaire, owner of one of the largest corporations in Manhattan, known for his ruthless business acumen and for never caring about anything that didn't involve dollar signs. To her, he was merely a distant symbol of an unattainable world, someone who inhabited luxurious salons, expensive dinners, and private planes, while she inhabited dark corridors, crowded buses, and cramped bedrooms. And yet, every night, her life intertwined with his without either of them realizing it, as she cleaned the desk where he signed million-dollar contracts, emptied the wastebaskets where secret negotiation papers ended up, and arranged chairs she would never sit in, as if she were an invisible presence in his universe. One night, after a day more exhausting than the others, Sarah opened her notebook in the middle of the conference room and wrote with all her heart, letting the pen bleed onto the paper, her greatest fears and her greatest desires. She spoke of the desire to see Erin smile without worry, of the desire to smell the sea for the first time, and of the fear of growing old without ever having been embraced by someone who said, "I won't leave you." The tears flowed, falling onto the paper, but she didn't realize that, when she was hurriedly called to another floor, she left the notebook on the table, alone, fragile and full of secrets, as if fate had decided to intervene and reveal her soul to the world that until then had never noticed her. Shortly after midnight, Richard Bennett returned to his office in search of urgent documents, still dressed in his impeccable suit, his expression rigid as if he knew no rest. When he entered his office, something caught his eye. On the desk, among the organized stacks of reports, sat a jarring object, an old notebook with a worn cover that seemed at odds with the perfection around it. Curious, he opened it and found simple yet emotionally charged handwriting, and in the very first lines he found confessions of dreams, small and profound, like having a home where he could hear a child's laughter, planting flowers in a backyard, or simply watching the sunrise without rushing to leave. Richard felt strange, as if those words spoke directly to him, breaking through a barrier no one had been able to cross for a long time. Flipping through more pages, he realized there was much more than dreams there. There was hidden pain, disguised scars, but also a hope that stubbornly blossomed, even amid poverty and abandonment. For a man who had spent years believing the world was merely an arena for disputes and conquests, those sentences were like a punch in the chest, awakening feelings he'd forgotten existed. Each line seemed to disarm him. Each confession seemed to tear away a piece of the masks he'd constructed throughout his life. Suddenly, he found himself curious, intrigued, and above all, touched by someone he didn't even know who he was, but who seemed to know his own loneliness. Without thinking, he slipped the notebook into his jacket pocket, as if he had found a hidden treasure no one else could see. On the drive home, he couldn't resist the temptation to open it again and read in silence in the dim light of the car, discovering there a dream world that contrasted sharply with the coldness of his own life. Richard, accustomed to sleeping surrounded by luxury and silence, fell asleep that night with the notebook beside his bed, as if it were a talisman that brought back something he had lost long ago. The ability to believe in something beyond numbers, beyond money, beyond loneliness disguised as power. Meanwhile, in a small, damp, freezing room on the other side of town, Sarah rummaged through her bag in despair, realizing her notebook was gone. Her heart sank, as if she had lost not just written pages but entire parts of her life. She wept silently beside Aaron, who slept peacefully, oblivious to her mother's heartache. For that simple woman, the notebook wasn't just an object. It was her safe haven, her memory, her future written in dreams, and the thought of having lost it was like being ripped from the little that still held her together. Unaware that at that very moment a millionaire was secretly reading her words, she fell asleep vowing to search until she found them, because no one takes away our right to dream, not even destiny. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the building early, her heart racing, her anguished eyes searching every corner of the room where she believed she had left the notebook, but nothing was there, as if it had been swallowed by the cold floor. She searched in the drawers, under the table, even in the garbage bags already collected, and when she couldn't find it, she felt as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. The building security guard looked at her strangely when he saw her kneeling on the luxurious carpet, but Sarah didn't care, because that notebook wasn't just paper. It was the portrait of her soul. With tears in her eyes, she retreated into silence, swallowing the pain, without realizing that at that very moment it was stored in the most unlikely safe, the inside pocket of Richard Bennett's impeccable suit. Across town, Richard couldn't shake thoughts of the pages he'd read the night before, as if the unfamiliar voice that had written each word had taken up residence in his mind. He found himself rereading sentences in the middle of important meetings, as if searching for a greater meaning than any financial report could offer. Although he was accustomed to seeing people as mere bargaining chips, Richard felt a strange need to discover who the author of that notebook was. More than curiosity, it was as if he needed to look into her eyes, because he had found in the pages a reflection of his own hidden loneliness, and that bothered him. Meanwhile, Sarah walked home with heavy shoulders, her heart heavy with the absence of her notebook and the fear of having lost forever the records of her most intimate dreams. As she hugged Aaron, who ran smiling towards her, she realized she needed to feign strength, even when her soul was shattered. That night, Sarah wrote on loose scraps of paper what she remembered of the dreams she didn't want to lose, but with each line she felt a greater emptiness, as if nothing could replace the notebook that had been with her for years. It was as if she had lost a part of her own memory, something that no one else could give back. Richard, in turn, began carrying the notebook with him everywhere, reading it silently in the car, at the office, and even before bed, almost like an addiction. In secret, he began writing notes in the margins, comments he would never have the courage to say aloud, as if he were conversing with that unknown soul through the pages. Days passed, and Sarah continued to discreetly search for the notebook, wondering if someone had found it and thrown it away, unaware that the millionaire she barely dared look in the eyes had already turned those pages into his new obsession. And while she felt increasingly invisible, he began to see her in every sentence he read, even without knowing who she was. Fate, silent and calculated, began to move its pieces, uniting two lives so distant around a notebook that should not have been in Richard's hands, but which now seemed to have found exactly the place where it needed to be, about to reveal truths that would change everything. Sarah returned to the same office each night with a secret hope that the notebook would miraculously appear in some forgotten corner, but as the days passed, that hope turned into silent despair, for it wasn't just a lost object, it was as if she had dropped her very soul into unknown hands. She swept the hallways with a heavy heart, her gaze lost, trying to hide her pain from colleagues who barely noticed her presence. At the same time, she carried Aaron in her thoughts, remembering how the girl would always ask before bed, "Mommy, will you tell me another beautiful dream tomorrow?" And now Sarah found herself without answers, without words, without strength, as if the magic that held them together had been ripped from her. In her mind, a question hammered relentlessly. Who would have the notebook? What if someone discovered secrets that should never leave her heart? Meanwhile, Richard Bennett seemed to sink deeper and deeper into those pages, unable to ignore the intensity they conveyed, as if each line were written for him, as if that anonymous voice knew him better than anyone else in his life. In his lonely early mornings, he would reread passages that spoke of fear, of faith, of courage in the midst of misery, and he would feel a disturbing mixture of admiration and melancholy, for he discovered in the stranger's words a strength he himself lacked. Despite all the money and power he wielded, and the more he read, the more an almost obsessive need grew within him to discover who the woman behind those confessions was, a need that became dangerous. For Richard had never been moved by emotion, only by logic, and now he found himself on the brink of a gentle madness that prevented him from thinking of anything other than that notebook. One rainy morning, upon arriving at the building, Sarah was called by one of the secretaries to quickly clean the main room before an early meeting. She hurried in, carrying buckets and rags, but when she came across the impeccably tidy desk, she felt a pang in her chest, for that was where she had left her notebook, and the memory made her shudder as if reliving the moment of loss. Without realizing it, Richard entered the room soon after, unexpectedly, and for a few seconds their eyes met. Hers filled with fright and his filled with a strange curiosity, as if trying to decipher an invisible enigma. Sarah immediately lowered her head, blushing with shame, feeling even smaller before the imposing figure of the man who controlled this universe that was not hers. Richard stood still for a few moments, watching the humble way she moved, and something in his chest tightened, a feeling he couldn't name, as if he had already read the essence of that woman without ever having truly known her. For a moment, he felt the urge to ask her name, to start a simple conversation, but he held back, because there was no logic in exposing his strange obsession with a dream notebook, and so he simply watched in silence until she left, carrying buckets and rags, never imagining that this encounter would be just the first of many unspoken glances. And deep down, Richard began to suspect that perhaps the owner of the notebook might be closer than he had ever imagined. That night, Sarah returned home exhausted, but something inside her remained restless, as if she had felt the presence of a gaze piercing her soul. Aaron ran into her arms, hugging her with the pure joy of a child who knows no weight of adults, and asked once more to hear about a new dream. But Sarah was silent for a few seconds, fighting the lump in her throat, until finally she made up a short story about castles in the sky and enchanted gardens, only to see her daughter's eyes light up before falling asleep. As she lay beside her, however, she couldn't hold back the tears, silently asking God if she would ever get back what she had lost. Richard, at the same time, was looking out the window of his luxurious penthouse, his notebook open on the glass table, and for the first time in years, he put aside reports and contracts to immerse himself in a life that was not his own. Rereading a page where the author spoke of her fear of growing old alone, he felt a pang he had never admitted aloud, because even surrounded by wealth, he also feared the same fate. And in that instant he realized that perhaps the distance between them was not as great as the worlds they lived in. And it was there, in that solitude, that Richard made an unexpected decision, not only to discover who the owner of the notebook was, but also to get closer to his truth, no matter the cost. The next day, fate seemed to play a trick on them both when Sarah, absent-mindedly, dropped an old handkerchief in the hallway of the executive floor, and Richard, passing by minutes later, found the object on the floor, picking it up between his fingers and smelling a soft perfume that seemed to carry the same sweetness as the pages he had read so often. Deep within him, a suspicion began to grow, and his eyes immediately turned to the young maid he had seen days before, remembering the way she had lowered her head and avoided contact. He still wasn't sure, but something in his heart told him that this woman could be more than just an invisible employee. She could be the soul that had restored a lost sense of purpose to him. Sarah, for her part, had no idea she was being watched so intensely, and went about her daily life with the silent dignity of someone who already carried the weight of the world. But inside her, there was a whirlwind. The feeling of loss, the fear of being judged if someone had read her confessions, and the fragile hope of finding the notebook again consumed her, robbing her of sleep. And although she tried to hide the pain she felt from Aaron, the girl perceived in her eyes a sadness that did not disappear even when she smiled and sometimes asked, "Mommy, do you still dream?" And Sarah only responded with a kiss on the forehead because words failed her. The suspense intensified as if an invisible string were about to snap, uniting two lives around handwritten secrets. Richard, now torn between the reason that had always guided his life and the emotion the notebook aroused, began to devise ways to discover the truth, while Sarah walked increasingly distressed, believing she had forever lost the only link to her dreams. And so, between chance encounters and silent signs, the story set the stage for a revelation that would change not only their fates, but also the way each understood love, loneliness, and the power of dreams. If this story is making your heart ache, subscribe to the channel now, because only here will you find narratives that touch you deeply, that bring tears to your eyes, and that remind you that even the most impossible dreams can transform destinies. Don't miss the next chapters. Your subscription is what keeps the mission alive of bringing you stories that could be your own life, told with emotion, intensity, and truth. Richard Bennett was no longer the same cold man who entered his office only to sign contracts and lead meetings, because now every step he took was accompanied by the silent memory of the notebook that rested on his desk, as if it were a mirror of what he had always avoided facing within himself. With each word he read, he felt the strange sensation that he had spent years ignoring the essential. And for the first time he began to wonder if true power lay not in money, but in the ability to dream, something that this stranger seemed to have in abundance, even living with so little. Sarah, for her part, spent her nights awake, wondering if someone was laughing at her words, if they were mocking her secret desires for a better future, and the fear of being exposed gnawed at her, because she knew that people didn't understand the heart of someone who dreams big despite poverty. Deep inside her, there was a deep conflict between wounded pride and the hope that the notebook could return, for within it were not only dreams, but proof that she still believed in miracles, even after so many closed doors. Every time she hugged Aaron before sleeping, she felt the need to fight harder, to not give up, even though everything seemed to conspire against it. One gray afternoon, as rain pounded the building's glass windows, Richard entered the meeting room carrying the notebook as if it were a confidential document. But instead of putting it away, he left it on the table and simply stared at the worn cover and the fragile letters that announced, "My dreams." In that silent contemplation, he felt something he had never experienced before. Profound respect for someone who dared to write down their desires despite having nothing, while he, the owner of everything, no longer had any dreams to record. And it was in this brutal contrast that his heart began to open to a truth he had always avoided. Wealth does not save anyone from loneliness. Sarah entered that same room a few hours later, just to clean the carpet and arrange chairs, but when she noticed her boss's momentary absence, her gaze fell on the table and for a second she thought she saw her notebook there. She approached with uncertain steps, but before she could reach out, Richard suddenly returned, and the surprise made her drop the bucket she was carrying, spilling water across the floor. Terrified, Sarah immediately bent down to clean it, apologizing in a low voice, unaware that Richard was watching her with an intensity that made her tremble, because in that instant, he began to be certain that this humble woman hid a universe that needed to be revealed. Richard could have called security, could have been angered by the accident, but something inside him prevented him from acting coldly, and instead, he offered his own hand to help her up, a simple gesture that for Sarah was as unexpected as it was disconcerting. She, accustomed to being invisible, felt the weight of a gaze that didn't judge her, but seemed to search for answers in her soul, and for a few seconds she was paralyzed, unsure whether to accept the outstretched hand or step back to preserve her fragility. When she finally got up on her own without touching him, she quickly left the room, taking with her her racing heart and the feeling that something strange was happening. Outside, Sarah leaned against the cold wall of the corridor, trying to catch her breath, because for the first time in her life she felt that she was not just a shadow in the world of someone so powerful, but rather a noticeable presence. She couldn't explain it, but that look of Richard's had pierced her like an arrow, revealing her most intimate vulnerability, and it left her torn between fear and a hidden hope that refused to die. She didn't imagine, however, that inside the room Richard was holding the notebook tightly, certain that he was getting closer and closer to discovering the truth. That night, Sarah tried to distract herself by cooking something simple for Aaron, but her mind kept returning to the unexpected encounter, as if the touch that never happened had left invisible marks on her skin. Aaron, watching her mother silently, asked softly, "Mommy, are you thinking about your dreams?" And that sentence was like a punch to her soul, because yes, she thought about her lost dreams all the time, but she didn't have the courage to admit to her daughter that her heart was broken. Instead, she smiled sweetly and told a new made-up story, because she didn't want her daughter to grow up believing that dreams die in poverty. Meanwhile, Richard walked alone through the corridors of his penthouse, unable to get the image of the young woman who bent down in terror to clean the floor out of his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw in her the same silent strength that overflowed from the pages of the notebook. He felt that destiny was pushing him toward an inevitable encounter, but at the same time, reason screamed at him not to cross the invisible line between boss and maid. However, his heart, rebellious and hungry, had already made a silent decision. He would discover the truth, even if he had to face his own fear of feeling. In Aaron's room, Sarah watched her daughter fall asleep hugging the worn teddy bear, and felt a deep pang as she realized that this child deserved more than she could offer, deserved the bright future recorded in the missing pages of the notebook. And it was in this silence, broken only by the girl's quiet breathing, that Sarah found the courage to pray, asking God for a miracle, a small sign that it was still worth believing. At that very moment, in another part of town, Richard opened the notebook again and quietly read a sentence that would change everything. "One day, someone will believe in me, even when the whole world ignores me." That sentence echoed inside Richard like thunder, and for the first time in many years, he felt tears flow uncontrollably, not of sadness, but of recognition, as if that stranger had written exactly what he, deep down, had always wanted, to be truly seen. At that moment, there was no turning back, for his heart was determined to find the owner of those words, whatever the cost, even if it meant challenging everything he had ever believed about power, pride, and the distance between worlds. The next morning, Richard arrived early at the office, but not to sign contracts or check reports, but because he could no longer control his anxiety to review the notebook and find in it some definitive clue about the author's identity, since each page seemed to speak directly to his deepest wounds, as if that mysterious person held the key to open doors he had locked for decades. And this disturbed him more than any negotiation worth millions could disturb him, because he had plenty of money. But meaning, that was what had been missing from his life for a long time. Sarah, exhausted from a sleepless night, entered the building with slow steps, but determined to keep her head held high, because despite the pain of not having the notebook in her hands, she knew she had to keep working. After all, Aaron depended on her for everything. Deep down, each corridor she walked through brought her the secret hope of finding her lost treasure. But reason insisted on reminding her that people like her were not entitled to miracles. And this duality gnawed at her, as if she were stuck between giving up on dreaming and continuing to believe against all logic. As Sarah discreetly cleaned the rooms, Richard watched her from afar, unannounced, studying every gesture, every expression of weariness on her face, and the more he saw her, the more he felt that his intuition was not deceiving him. There was something about her that connected directly with the words in the notebook, and it made him burn with curiosity, as if he were an investigator faced with a mystery impossible to ignore. He knew he was crossing the line of reason, but he also felt that, for the first time, he genuinely cared about someone other than himself. And that was a new, almost frightening feeling. Sarah, for her part, was carrying an internal turmoil, because she was beginning to notice that her boss was looking at her differently, as if he saw something beyond her simple appearance and the worn uniform she wore. This perception left her alert, torn between the fear of being the target of some kind of humiliation and the even greater fear of believing that there could be something true in that unexpected attention. And while she tried to push her thoughts away, she continued to work, without realizing that her every move was closely followed by eyes that no longer knew whether they were seeking answers or simply being captivated. One silent night, Richard decided to take the notebook home again, but this time, instead of just reading, he began writing some answers on the blank pages, as if he were dialoguing with the invisible author. He asked what made her believe in miracles, told her about his own loneliness disguised behind figures and contracts, and confessed that he also secretly dreamed of being found by someone who saw him beyond the title of millionaire, thus revealing a fragility he had never exposed to anyone, because he had learned from an early age that vulnerability was a sign of weakness. As he wrote, a strange sense of freedom washed over him, because for the first time he wasn't worried about judgments or social masks, only about the truth that welled up from the depths of his soul. In that moment, Richard discovered that words had the power to heal, that the dreams of a stranger were helping to rescue the broken pieces of his own story, and this revelation was so overwhelming that he realized he needed to find this woman, not just to thank her, but because he knew his life would never be the same without her. On the other side of town, Sarah woke from a nightmare where she was desperately searching for Aaron amid dark streets filled with mocking voices. She woke up sweaty, with tears in her eyes, clutching the chest of her daughter who slept peacefully beside her. This dream left her even more fragile, because it seemed like an omen that she might lose what little she had, and the absence of the notebook only increased the feeling that fate was playing cruelly with her faith. However, when she looked at the sleeping Aaron, she promised herself that, whatever happened, she would never stop fighting for that child. In the office, fate began to show its first signs of revelation when Richard forgot the notebook open on the table, on a page where he had written his reply to the unknown author, and when Sarah came in to clean it, she couldn't help but notice the newly written words. She approached cautiously, and when she read the firm handwriting that wasn't hers, she felt her whole body tremble, because it meant that someone had found her notebook. Someone was reading her secret dreams, and worse, responding to them, as if they had invaded the most sacred place of her soul. Sarah recoiled in fright, nearly knocking over her chair, and fear gripped her thoughts. Who could do this? Who could be tampering with something so intimate to her? At the same time, a silent part of her heart beat faster, because there was something in the written words that conveyed sincerity, as if the writer were also someone lost in search of answers. And between panic and hope, she found herself paralyzed, unable to pick up the notebook, but also unable to ignore the fact that her life was about to change forever. When Richard suddenly entered and found Sarah standing at the table, staring at the notebook, he felt a shock run through his body, because he realized that he was faced with the truth he had been searching for. There was no longer any doubt, it was she, the young woman who cleaned his hallways at night, the author of the words that were healing his soul. In that instant, the silence became heavy, their eyes met, and they both understood, without saying a word, that destiny had just united two completely opposite worlds, and that from then on nothing would be the same again. The air grew thick as Richard and Sarah stared at each other across the table, each absorbing the silent impact of that moment, as if the whole world had stopped to observe the tension that hung between them. Sarah felt her heart race, the fear that her entire life would suddenly be exposed overwhelming her, while Richard fought the need to say something, anything, but at the same time understood that words could ruin the magic of their encounter, that the truth still needed to be revealed carefully. In that instant, they both realized that something far greater than attraction or curiosity united them. It was destiny, working invisibly but powerfully to bring together two souls who should never have met by chance, but who, somehow, needed to learn to trust each other before any feelings could blossom. Sarah looked away, feeling the weight of the silence, and walked slowly to pick up the notebook, but hesitated, as if touching it would open doors to secrets she wasn't yet ready to confront. Richard took a step forward, but stopped, respecting the distance she was clearly trying to maintain, realizing that any hasty gesture could shatter the fragile barrier that still existed between them. They were both breathing deeply, and in the air hung the feeling that something momentous was about to happen, something that would transform not only their relationship, but also the way they each viewed their own lives and the dreams they carried. Even without realizing it, each small gesture became charged with meaning, tension, and intense emotion, creating an almost unbreathable atmosphere within that silent room, lit only by the natural light that streamed in through the large glass windows. Richard finally spoke, his voice low, firm, but filled with a restrained emotion Sarah would never have expected to hear from someone like him. "Sarah, did you write all of this down?" The mere mention of his name made her recoil even further, feeling a mixture of shame, surprise, and disbelief, because she had never imagined he knew her name or had read every detail of her dreams and fears. Her entire body trembled, and for a few seconds she couldn't utter a word, just clutching the notebook as if it were a shield capable of protecting her from everything that might come, from judgment, disbelief, or even from feelings she didn't yet fully understand, but which were beginning to grow inside her in a way that was impossible to ignore. Richard took another step closer, but without invading Sarah's space, simply making it clear that he wanted to understand, to get to know her, not to frighten her. His eyes weren't filled with criticism, but with admiration, and yet Sarah felt the weight of a crushing doubt. Why would he be interested in a maid like her, a simple woman with no possessions, no status, only dreams written in a notebook that could have been discarded by anyone? This question hammered at her mind, creating an emotional barrier almost impossible to cross, and she constantly backed away, as if needing to protect not only her own dignity, but also the fragments of hope she still carried for Aaron and for herself. Meanwhile, Richard took a deep breath, realizing that the silence and distrust were natural, because he also understood that it had never been easy to trust anyone, and that for Sarah it was even more complicated, as her world was made of caution and constant fear of losing everything. However, something in his heart told her that she needed protection, but also courage, and that only by opening up to him could she discover that she was not alone, even in the midst of a life of hardship and loss. And so, with every look, with every restrained gesture, Richard tried to convey not only respect, but also the silent promise that he would never violate her privacy or exploit her dreams without permission. Sarah finally took a deep breath, opening the notebook just a crack, and Richard instinctively stepped back, letting her take the lead, realizing that trust couldn't be imposed but earned. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the pages, and Richard followed each movement with a heavy heart, because each line he read again reinforced the feeling that this woman had something extraordinary, something he would never find in the world of power and wealth he knew. It was as if each word were a bridge between their souls, and at the same time, proof that dreams and hopes could, in fact, unite different worlds in an almost miraculous way. The silence between them began to transform into a tangible presence, charged with restrained emotion, as if the room itself were pulsing with a growing tension between them. Sarah, feeling strangely vulnerable, decided to speak, her voice low, almost a whisper. I never thought anyone would read this, much less care." Richard smiled slightly, with a rare softness in his normally rigid posture, and replied, "I didn't just read it, Sarah. I felt every word. And somehow, you made me realize things about myself I'd forgotten, things no amount of money could give me." With each exchange, the barrier between fear and trust began to break, slowly, as if they were both dancing around an emotional precipice, where only one gesture could determine whether they would fall together or drift apart forever. Sarah realized that Richard was not just a cold businessman, but someone capable of being moved by another person's fragility and sincerity, and this awakened in her a curiosity and a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. She took a deep breath, pushing aside some of her distrust, although she still maintained reservations, because she knew that trust was a risk, but that perhaps it would be worth it if her heart asked. Richard, realizing that Sarah's every gesture and word carried as much fear as courage, decided to take a bold but careful step, offering not only attention but also a silent promise. He would be someone she could trust, even if she wasn't yet ready to fully believe him. That night, between restrained glances and deep breaths, they both discovered that the fine line between distrust and emotional bond could be crossed, and that the notebook now was not just a lost object, but the invisible link that began to unite two lives so different and, at the same time, so complementary. And so, the day ended with both of them feeling something new and uncertain. Fear, hope, curiosity, and a silent desire to know each other more, to break through barriers and allow their hearts to find something they never imagined possible. The notebook remained on the table, a silent witness to a first contact charged with tension and emotion, ready to be the catalyst for the next discoveries, the next truths, and the first real step in a story that promised to completely transform the fate of Sarah, Aaron, and Richard, making it clear that when dreams meet courage, miracles can happen. The silence in Richard's office was different this time, no longer heavy and tense, but charged with anticipation and curiosity. Sarah remained close to the table, her notebook clutched to her chest, feeling the warmth of his presence and, for the first time, the strange sensation that she could allow herself to trust him, even if only for a few minutes, as Richard approached slowly, his smile restrained, his eyes fixed on hers, conveying something that words could never express. A profound recognition of her courage, her vulnerability, and the quiet strength that kept her going despite all the adversities she faced. She took a deep breath and finally broke the ice, looking directly at him and saying, her voice soft, almost trembling, I didn't know anyone would truly care about those words. I thought they would just be ignored, forgotten, or worse, ridiculed. Richard tilted his head, observing every expression on her face, and replied with absolute sincerity, Never. I felt every line as if you were speaking to me directly. And there is nothing more powerful than someone having the courage to expose their dreams and fears unapologetically. Sarah was surprised by the intensity of what she heard, and felt her heart beat faster, because this was the first time someone had understood her so completely, without judgment, without reservations, simply observing the essence of who she truly was. Richard sat in the chair across from her, keeping a respectful distance but so that he could feel Sarah's presence, and continued, You know, reading your dreams, I realized that you have something many adults never have, the ability to believe even when everything around you insists it's impossible. And that is extraordinary. Sarah blushed slightly, looking away for a moment, but feeling that within her an old, almost forgotten flame began to rekindle, because no one had said something so true and intense about her soul. Even with the humility and fear she carried, something in her began to open, allowing vulnerability to coexist with a shy smile that appeared on her lips. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and asked gently, Do you really believe that dreams like that can change someone's life? Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, and replied firmly but tenderly, I do. because you showed me that words, when written with sincerity and passion, can move things that money and power never could. You made me realize that dreams aren't just illusions, Sarah. They're paths. Sarah felt the impact of those words like a fresh breeze piercing her weary soul, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps those two very different worlds could truly connect, not just through the notebook, but through the people they had become through it. The mood in the room slowly shifted from tension and distrust to something softer, almost intimate, and Richard, sensing the effect of his words, decided to reveal a little more about himself. I've lived much of my life surrounded by luxury, but alone. I've learned that money buys comfort, but never love, never understanding. Never someone who truly sees you for who you are. Sarah watched him closely, sensing a rare sincerity in every sentence, and realized this was a unique opportunity to get to know someone genuinely. Someone who could see her not just as a maid, but as a whole woman with dreams, fears, and courage. And as she listened to him, something inside her began to unravel, dissolving emotional barriers that had previously seemed insurmountable. She took a deep breath, feeling her courage finally blossom, and said with a slight smile, "No one has ever said anything like that to me. No one has truly cared about my dreams, not even my own family sometimes. I've always felt like I had to fight alone." Richard leaned in a little closer, respectfully approaching, and spoke tenderly. "So allow yourself to believe that you no longer have to fight alone, Sarah. Not just with your dreams, but with life. And I don't say this out of politeness or kindness. I say it because I felt every word you say, every line in your notebook, and I understand that you deserve someone by your side who values every part of you." Sarah felt a mixture of surprise and warmth course through her, as if that truth were simultaneously unexpected and inevitable, and realized that the bond between them strengthened with every sentence, with every breath they shared. The notebook remained on the table, silent, a witness to what was happening, as if it itself knew that this encounter wasn't just about written words, but about souls meeting. Richard pointed discreetly to an open page and said, "Do you realize you taught me something I'd forgotten? About believing, about feeling, and maybe about allowing myself to be happy again?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes shining, and replied, "And you taught me that even the most different worlds can meet, that there's no need to be afraid to dream alongside someone who might be worth it." In that instant, something silent and powerful began to emerge between them, like a dance of souls recognizing each other and allowing themselves to feel beyond the differences and barriers that separated them. Richard gave a slight smile, moving even closer, and said, "So, if you'll allow it, Sarah, I'd like to walk beside you, not just in the pages of your notebook, but in real life, discovering your dreams and, who knows, helping you realize them." Sarah felt her heart race, a mixture of joy and disbelief, and replied softly, I think I'd like that too. But I don't know if I can fully believe it yet." Richard held her gaze, conveying patience and understanding, taking his time, allowing her to feel she could open up in her own time. And in that simple, silent, yet intense gesture, an implicit promise was born, charged with hope and pure emotion. Finally, the conversation ended, but it left a trail of enchantment and anticipation, as if they both knew that moment had changed something within each of them. Sarah carefully collected the notebook, but this time there was no fear, only respect and a hint of excitement for what might come. Richard, watching her every gesture, felt more connected than he had ever imagined possible, realizing that that invisible link made of words, dreams, and courage had become the bridge between two hearts that were finally beginning to understand each other, to value each other, and perhaps even to love each other. The day began with heavy clouds over the city, reflecting the whirlwind of thoughts in Sarah's mind, which felt like something was about to spiral out of control. As she cleaned the conference room, she couldn't help but think of Richard's words, his intense gaze, and the silent promises he'd made. But at the same time, an old fear crept into her chest. Have I gone too far? Who am I to dream of someone like him? The notebook lay on the table, a silent testament to her simple, solitary life, and she felt the magic created by those pages could now transform her irreversibly, something her cautious mind and fragile heart couldn't immediately handle. It created a knot in her stomach that made her tremble as she adjusted her chair and took deep breaths, trying to compose herself. Richard entered the room with soft but firm steps, as if the gravity of the moment weighed on his every move. Seeing her back, her body tense and her gaze distant, he immediately realized something was frightening her, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He moved closer, trying to convey reassurance, but Sarah looked away and said, almost whispering, I don't know if I should have let my dreams get that far. Maybe I should be content with the life I've always had." Richard, surprised by the confession, felt a mixture of tenderness and determination, realizing that this was the moment to show her that the limits Sarah placed on herself were merely imaginary walls, built by old fears, and that he was there to help her tear them down. Before she could respond, the phone rang, and an unexpected announcement came from the main office. One of the investors had abruptly questioned a recent decision, and the situation threatened to cause turbulence in Richard's corporate routine. It was an external, real problem that demanded her immediate attention, and for a moment, reality invaded the atmosphere of connection that had been created. Sarah felt panic rising, interpreting the chaos outside as a sign that her dreams might bring problems she was not ready to face, and a chill ran down her spine, reminding her that her life had always been simple and predictable, and that perhaps now she was exposing herself too much, opening herself to risks far beyond what she was accustomed to bearing. Richard took a deep breath, realizing the effect the stress of the moment was having on Sarah. He decided to remain calm, approaching and lightly touching her hand on the table, a gesture that conveyed firmness, security, and the promise that she didn't have to face anything alone. He said in a low but intense voice, "Sarah, this isn't your fault, and it doesn't mean you were wrong to dream. The world out there can be complicated, but here, we can handle it together." She felt his hand on hers, and something inside her broke through the barrier of fear, a spark of courage mixed with desire, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she wasn't alone in facing the risks of life or of emotion itself. The tension continued, as the phone signal rang and the office seemed to vibrate with the urgency of the situation outside. But Richard, sensing the emotional impact on Sarah, decided to resume the conversation they both needed to have. He leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact, and said, "Look at me, Sarah. I've read your words, I've felt your dreams, and nothing that happens out there changes what I see here. You are strong, courageous, and deserve to live every single thing you've written." Sarah, hearing those words, felt the fear she'd carried for so long begin to dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief and warmth, as if his touch and his sincere words had ignited an inner fire she'd never dared acknowledge. She took a deep breath, finally allowing herself to relax, and murmured, I never thought anyone could believe in me so much. And now, with you here, I don't know whether to fear or surrender." Richard smiled, a smile laden with emotion, and replied softly, "There's no need to fear when we're together, Sarah. And if there's one thing we need to learn, it's that we shouldn't be afraid to surrender to what we feel, even when it seems impossible." The look they exchanged in that moment was charged with intensity, every gesture conveying desire, admiration, and the realization that their connection was about to become irresistible, impossible to ignore. The atmosphere, previously heavy with Sarah's fear and the external urgency, began to dissolve into an electrifying atmosphere, where every shared breath held the promise of something new. The touch of hands, now lightly intertwined, conveyed security and temptation simultaneously, and the silence that hung between them was more eloquent than any words, speaking of contained desires, of emerging trust, and of an attraction that could no longer be denied. Sarah felt her heart race, her entire body responding to his presence, while Richard realized that the passion growing between them was now impossible to contain, and that every second without contact would be a challenge to reason and the control they had both tried to maintain. The notebook, lying open on the table, seemed to silently bear witness to this transformation, as if each page became a symbol of the union that was emerging between them. Sarah looked at Richard, hesitating for a moment, but feeling that she could trust this man who not only understood her, but also desired her with respect and intensity. And in that moment, something inside her surrendered, allowing herself to feel not only admiration and security, but a growing, uncontrollable passion that consumed her from the inside out, bringing heat and excitement while dissolving the old fear that had always accompanied her. Richard, sensing Sarah's silent surrender, approached carefully, leaning in slightly and saying, his voice hoarse with emotion, "Sarah, I want you to know that I'm here, not just for today, not just for this moment, but because you've touched me in a way I never thought possible." Sarah, feeling his intensity, could no longer hold back the impulse and replied in a whisper, "Richard, me too. I never thought I could feel something like this, but now I can't deny it." In that instant, the outside world disappeared, the urgency of the phone, the problems of routine, all the old fears vanished, and all that remained was the intensity of the connection between them, the passion that was becoming impossible to control, and the notebook that silently sealed the bond that was finally becoming indestructible. That moment marked a decisive turning point in both their lives. Sarah finally understood that dreaming was not a risk, but a bridge to happiness, while Richard realized that the truest power lay not in money or control, but in the ability to allow oneself to love and be loved. The notebook, the words, the fears and desires converged in that instant when passion took hold, transforming everything that had been uncertainty into a burning fire of emotion, desire, and the certainty that, finally, two hearts destined to meet had found not only companionship, but the intensity of a love that could no longer be contained. After the whirlwind of the day, Sarah and Richard remained in the living room, the notebook still open between them, as if it were the bridge between what they felt and what they still needed to discover about each other. Their breathing was heavy, a mixture of excitement, tension, and a silent connection that went far beyond words or gestures, touching directly to the essence of their hearts. Sarah, for the first time in a long time, felt she could allow herself to be whole, without fear of judgment, and Richard realized he had never met anyone capable of awakening such pure and intense emotions with their simple presence, with the courage to dream, write and feel. She finally broke the silence, her voice low and trembling, confessing, "Richard, I never imagined anyone could care so much or feel so much for my words. My fragility." Richard held her hand firmly, conveying calm and desire at the same time, and replied, "Sarah, it's not just about words. It's about who you are. Every detail, every dream, every fear. I want to be here not to judge, but to share it all with you, to feel it with you." The intensity of it made Sarah's heart race, and a spark of passion began to grow silently, enveloping every gesture, every look, as if time had stopped just for them. She took a deep breath, leaning in slightly, allowing herself to feel his presence fully, and said, I've never allowed myself to feel anything like this. I've always lived in fear, always alone. But now, with you, it's different." Richard leaned in, his face close to hers, unhurried, exuding confidence, and replied, "And it will always be different, Sarah, if you let me. I don't just want your dreams, I want you. All of you, with every fear, every desire, every part you've always hidden." In that instant, Sarah felt the barrier separating their worlds begin to dissolve, leaving room for something powerful, uncontrollable, that went beyond the notebook, the words, the fear, the passion that grew silently and irresistibly between them. The notebook, now almost forgotten on the table, seemed to have fulfilled its purpose, uniting two souls so different, yet so complementary. Richard brought his face even closer, looking into her eyes intensely, and said, "Do you understand that when two people meet like this, everything changes? Nothing seems impossible anymore. Nothing seems distant anymore. Only us." Sarah felt each word reverberate in her chest, the warmth of his voice, the closeness, and for an instant all fear disappeared, replaced by a growing desire to surrender, to allow that passion to take over, without limits, without barriers, as if it were the only truth that mattered in that moment. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel Richard's touch, his warmth so close, and murmured, "I never thought it was possible to feel something like this, so intense, so real." He smiled gently, caressing her face, and replied, "That's exactly why we're here, Sarah. To live what was always ours, even before we knew, even before we dreamed, even before the notebook brought us together." The tension turned to desire, the desire to passion, and the passion to a silent energy that enveloped them completely, making every second eternal, every touch unforgettable, every shared breath proof that something profound was being born between them. Sarah felt her entire body react, her heart pounding, her mind trying to process everything that was happening, and at the same time, surrendering to that which could not be controlled. Richard, sensing each reaction, moved even closer, holding her hand, then her face, and said, "Don't be afraid, Sarah. There is nothing to fear here, just feel. Feel every moment." She took a deep breath, surrendering to the intensity of the moment, letting emotion and desire guide every gesture, every thought, every part of her being, allowing that passion to finally manifest itself without reservation, without barriers, without doubt. Time seemed to stand still in the bright room, with a silent notebook bearing witness to the complete surrender of two hearts that had finally met. Sarah opened her eyes, gazing at Richard with tenderness and desire, and he responded with a deep gaze, conveying trust, desire, and promise simultaneously. Every touch, every gesture, every whisper transformed into a visceral connection, and they grew even closer, as if the outside world no longer existed, as if the past, the insecurities, and the routine had disappeared, leaving only the present, the moment in which they discovered each other, desired each other, and allowed themselves to feel. Richard took her hands in his, slowly lowering his face to rest his forehead against hers, and said softly, "Sarah, you're not alone anymore. Never again." Sarah smiled, moved, feeling a wave of heat run through her body, and replied, "And you? You're not alone either. And I want to be with you. I really do." In that instant, the space between them disappeared, and the passion became uncontrollable, consuming the fear, doubt, and loneliness, transforming each shared breath into a silent promise of total surrender and mutual discovery. The room fell silent except for the beating of their hearts, now synchronized, and the notebook remained open on the table, a symbol